Well, good morning, folks. And it is a good morning, only the sky is rather grey and dark and probably full of rain. But we'll proceed on this walk. So I'm going to take on the Famine Walk here at Doonpeter Graveyard and Holywell. And I'll just read the sign here in front of me. The well at Doonpeter goes back centuries before Christianity. This well had special religious significance. In pagan times, when Christianity took over the church, were built near the wells because groups of people were in the habit of meeting there. Gradually, Christian practices and prayers took over. Out of these developed the practice of rounds, such as decades of the rosary at each stone. It is not clear when the church at Doonpeter was built, but it is clear that O'Neill's army burned it on one of his visits south in 1599 to try to get Lord Barrymore to join him before the Battle of Kinsale. So there you go, there's a historic date, 1599. So folks, I'm going to take on this Famine Walk. The sky is rather threatening looking now. Sun is shining, but it's a sort of a watery sun. If good Irish way of saying things, a watery sun. But regardless, we'll tread on and see how we go. Okay? So come on with me and let's do this Famine Walk together. Now, you'd never really think that this was midsummer 2024. It's overcast now, sun has gone asleep, and midsummer's day is in a few days' time. So far, summer has been rather elusive. But the walking continues. Now, this Famine Walk consists of little trailways and bohereens and fields and forests. So there's a variation of landscapes. Now, I've had to zip up the top because here in the middle of pasture land, I'm very exposed. The sky looks severely threatening at the moment. There's a variation of trackways and trailways on this Famine Walk. Now I'm on a farm track, a livestock track. The pathway is pretty well defined. I'm looking forward though to the sheltered trail, which is deep in the woods as I go downhill here towards the old cemetery. Any gates and livestock trails that you go through, and gates and things that you have to open, make sure you close. A lot of the time you'll be on private land and you don't want livestock go wandering around the countryside. I've arrived here at Doonpeter Graveyard and Holywell. This is a very historic graveyard, and a lot of famine victims have been laid anonymously to rest here. And may they all rest in peace. They went through a horrendous time during the Great Famine. So here on an exposed hillside, their final resting place. Doonpeter was a site for pagan rituals that was taken over by the Catholic Church. It was mentioned in a decree from Rome in 1199. A church, approximately 24 by 20 feet, stood within a medieval enclosure here on the hillside. The church was destroyed by Hugh O'Neill in 1599 when the local landlord refused to join Hugh O'Neill's army in battle. There is a holy well associated with numerous cures at this site. When I kneel down here in this graveyard, as I've done before, and I read the inscriptions on this stone plaque here right in front of me, in memory of the many unbaptized children interred in this graveyard. And then there's the inscription of 2 little feet, 10 toes. There is no foot too small that it cannot leave an imprint on this world. Isn't that awfully profound? God loved them all. The only sign of anybody buried here, or the sign of a grave, is just a stone. And I'd say many don't have any stone at all, marking the spot of their final place of rest. The Great Famine, also known as the Great Hunger, on Gorta Moor, was a period of starvation and disease in Ireland lasting from 1845 to 1852 that constituted a historical social crisis and subsequently had a major impact on Irish society and history as a whole. The most severely affected areas were in the western and southern parts of Ireland, where the Irish language was dominant. During the Great Hunger, roughly 1 million people died, and more than 1 million more fled the Irish countryside, causing the country's population to fall by 20 to 25%. In some towns, populations fell as much as 67% between 1841 and 1871. Between 1845 and 1855, at least 2.1 million people left Ireland, primarily on packet ships, but also on steamboats. The proximate cause of the famine was the infection of potato crops by blight throughout Europe during the 1840s. Blight infection caused 100,000 deaths outside Ireland and influenced much of the unrest that culminated in European revolutions in 1841. Large amounts of food were exported from Ireland during the famine, and the refusal of London to bar such exports, as had been done on previous occasions, was an immediate and continuing source of controversy, contributing to anti-Irish sentiment and the campaign for independence. Additionally, the famine indirectly resulted in tens of thousands of households being evicted, exasperated by a provision forbidding access to workhouse aid while in possession of more than 1/4 of an acre of land. The Great Famine was a defined moment in the history of Ireland, which was part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland from 1801 to 1922. The famine and its effects permanently changed the island's demographic, political and cultural landscape, producing an estimated 2 million refugees and spurring a century-long population decline. For both the native Irish and those in the resulting diaspora, the famine entered folk memory. The strained relations between many Irish and their ruling British government worsened further because of the famine, heightening ethnic and sectarian tensions and boosting nationalism and republicanism both in Ireland and among Irish immigrants living around the world. The famine had become part of the long story of betrayal and exploitation which led to the growing movement in Ireland for independence. Ireland was brought into the United Kingdom in January 1801, following the passage of the Acts of Union. Executive power lay in the hands of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and Chief Secretary of Ireland, who were appointed by the British government. Ireland sent 105 members of Parliament to the House of Commons of the United Kingdom, and Irish representative peers elected 28 of their own number to sit for life in the House of Lords. Between 1832 and 1859, 70% of Irish representatives were landowners or the sons of landowners. I find an incredible sense of peace and quiet and sadness here. In the years from 1846 to 1850, thousands of people in this country, in rural Ireland, suffered death by hunger. Impoverished people, a lot under the thumb of a greater power, our neighbours. Yes, indeed, our neighbours. I'm standing here under a tree, sheltering from the rain, with a field full of livestock behind me, making their voices heard in unison. And this stone here on the floor says, "The Great Hunger on Gorta Moor, 1846 to 1850, in memory of the nameless victims of famine and fever who lie in this mass grave. May they all rest in peace." And I'm sure you'll all join with me in echoing those sentiments. Standing here, as I say, in the rain, there's a sense of peace and eternal quietness. Lives taken long before their time. It must be a terrible thing to have to die of hunger, living in straw huts and cabins with earthen floors, dampness, misery, cold, wet, pain and suffering. And a lot of this could have been prevented. I say once more, we must be a forgiving nation. What did these misfortunate people ever do to deserve a death like that? Just for those of you that may not have been able to decipher that corroded looking headstone and the inscriptions upon, it simply says, "William E. Hudson, Esquire, barrister at law, born in 1796 and died in 1853. Unlike the numerous simple stones marking the graves right around me here in this famine graveyard, this man, William E. Hudson, Esquire, obviously could afford to have a headstone put up. And I ask myself, why is there such inequality even back then in the 1800s? Whilst all these poor people behind me lay in the same ground within meters of this man here. And they're unmarked, and this guy has a headstone with his name upon. Oh dear, it's a place that really affects me quite significantly. I leave here with a saddened heart. Obviously, it's a place of sadness. It's a place of sadness, real deep sadness. In 1841, census showed a population in Ireland of just over 8 million. 2/3 of people depended on agriculture for their survival, but rarely received a working wage. They had to work for their landlords in return for a small patch of land to farm. This forced Ireland's peasantry to practice continuous monoculture, as the potato was the only crop that could meet nutritional needs. The potato was introduced in Ireland as a garden crop by the gentry. By the late 17th century, it had become widespread as a supplementary food. Their main diet was still based on butter, milk and grain products. So from a sad, though quiet and tranquil and peaceful place, a place full of people that passed away during a horrendous famine in Ireland. It's a shameful time in Irish history. A time that caused so many people to die, lose their lives. The Irish economy grew between 1760 and 1815 due to infrastructure expansion and the Napoleonic Wars, which happened between 1805 and 1815, which had increased the demand for food in Britain. Tillage increased to such an extent that there was only a small amount of land available to small farmers to feed themselves. The potato was adopted as a primary food source because of its quick growth in a comparatively small space. By 1800, the potato had become a staple food for 1 in 3 Irish people, especially in winter. It eventually became a staple year-round for farmers. A disproportionate share of the potatoes grown in Ireland were the Irish lumper, creating a lack of genetic variability among Irish plants, which increased vulnerability to disease. I seem to be awfully drawn to famine graveyards. Have been all my life. To graveyards, reading inscriptions on ancient and historic headstones. Now I'm entering a great big wood here after coming down through 2 fields. And woods are my favorite places. Woods, dense vegetation, peace and quiet. Now down here to my right, I can hear the flowing water. It's quite lonely, though awfully peaceful in here. Isn't this place absolutely beautiful? You can hear the river rapids now here to your right as I make my way down to that water level. When Ireland experienced food shortages in 1782 to 1783, the ports were closed to exporting food, with the intention of keeping locally grown food in Ireland to feed the hungry people. Irish food prices promptly dropped. Some merchants lobbied against the export ban, but the government in the 1780s overrode their protests. Nicholas McAvoy, parish priest of Kells, wrote in October 1845, "On my most minute personal inspection of the potato crop in this most fertile potato growing locale is founded my inexpressibly painful conviction that 1 family in 20 of the people will not have a single potato left on Christmas Day next. Many are the fields I have examined, and testimony the most solemn can I tender that in the great bulk of those fields, all the potatoes sizable enough to be sent to table are irreparably damaged, while for the remaining comparatively sounder fields, very little hopes are entertained in consequence of the daily rapid development of this deplorable disease. With starvation at our doors, grimly staring us, vessels laden with our sole hopes of existence, our provisions, are hourly wafted from our every port. From one milling establishment, I have seen last night not less than 50 dray loads of meal moving on to Drogheda, thence to go to feed the foreigner, leaving starvation and death, the sure and certain fate of the toil and sweat that raised this food. For their respective inhabitants, England, Holland, Scotland, Germany, are taking early the necessary precautions, getting provisions from every possible port of the globe, and I ask, are Irishmen alone unworthy the sympathies of a paternal gentry or a paternal government? Well, from my shady hollow and little piece of heaven this morning, good morning to you all. It is absolutely splendid, beautiful, peaceful and quiet here, surrounded and embraced by nature. If you were having a really bad downer today, I suggest you get yourself here or someplace like this where there's running water and nature abounds, and sit here for a while and ponder upon how lucky you are to be alive and to be graced with a presence such as this. This would certainly be, in my opinion, a shady hollow. Now, I move on from the shady hollow, further upriver. Now I'm still on the Famine Walk. Nearly fell on the Famine Walk there. According to historian James Donnelly, the picture of Irish people starving as their food was exported was the most powerful image in the national construct of the famine. Grain imports increased after the spring of 1847, and much of the debate has been conducted within narrow parameters, focusing almost exclusively on national estimates with little attempt to disaggregate the data by region or by product. Total charitable donations for famine relief might have been about £1.5 million, of which £856,500 came from outside Ireland. Donations within Ireland are harder to trace. £380,000 of donations were officially registered, but once some allowance is made for less formal donations, the Irish total probably exceeds that of Britain at £525,000. People of Irish descent also contributed to funds raised outside of Ireland, and those donations would have included in the region where the donation was made. English Protestants donated more to Irish famine relief than any other source outside of Ireland. I said to you earlier, over an hour ago at this stage, that there's a variation of landscapes as you make your way on this Famine Walk at Doonpeter. I need to get it right. Here we are in a paddock which is partially bogged and waterlogged, but there's water lilies, I suppose you can call those, and they're partially in bloom. And the sun has come out again as I came out into the open air, because I'm pretty wet from my knees down, having made my way through the high grass there in the last paddock. As I walk along here, enjoying my own company, I think that I'm so blessed to have terrain and countryside like this at my disposal. It's at everybody's disposal to wander about. You just take care of the landscape and take care of yourself when doing so. But to be able to get out into countryside like this, no risk, no danger. Well, unless you take a fall or something like that. And that's a possibility if you don't watch what you're doing. But to be able to roam around places like these, and of course to have all you people for company, is a huge plus and bonus. Contributions by the United States during the Irish famine were highlighted by Senator Henry Clay, who said, "No imagination can conceive, no tongue express, no brush paint the horrors of the scenes which are daily exhibited in Ireland." He called upon Americans to remind them that the practice of charity was the greatest act of humanity they could do. In total, 118 vessels sailed from the US to Ireland with relief goods valued at $545,145. Specific states which provided aid include South Carolina and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was the second most important state for famine relief in the US and the second largest shipping port for aid into Ireland. You know, when you walk this famine pathway, the mind naturally takes you back to times of hardship, when poor people, rural people living out here in out of the way communities, living in shacks and being evicted by the tyrants across the water, burning them out of their shacks, forcing these people with their kids to take camp by a ditch in a harsh Irish weather with little to no food, to take their property and amalgamate it into great big chunks of land, and the British take ownership of it. And then today I walk in their footsteps and I think about the harsh times that those misfortunate people existed in. Oh my goodness, I find it intolerable. For the last time, I'm going to say to you, we're either a nation of idiots or we're a nation of forgiving people. Landlords were responsible for paying the rates of every tenant whose yearly rent was less than £4 or less. Landlords whose land was crowded with poorer tenants were now faced with larger bills. Many began clearing the poor tenants from their small plots and letting the land out in larger plots for over £4, which then reduced their debts. In 1846 there had been some clearances, but the great mass of evictions came in 1847. According to James S. Donnelly Jr., it is impossible to be sure how many people were evicted during the years of the famine and its immediate aftermath. It was only in 1849 that the police began to keep account, and they recorded a total of almost 250,000 plus persons as officially being evicted between 1849 and 1854. Donnelly considered this to be an underestimate, and if the figures were to include the number pressured into voluntary surrenders during the whole period from 1846 to 1854, the figure would almost certainly exceed over 500,000 persons. While Helen Litton says there was also thousands voluntary surrenders, she notes that also there was precious little voluntary about them. In some cases, tenants were persuaded to accept a small sum of money to leave their homes, cheated into believing the workhouse would take them in. All the ingredients of nature are present this morning. Wet to begin with, cloud, dark and purple clouds. Now sunshine, dodging the clouds overhead and creating these rather dramatic and beautiful sunbeams as they dance and sail across the landscape. To my left hand side as I progress on my way on the Famine Walk. Now I'm just after discovering here something about Doonpeter's well, and it says Doonpeter's well and graveyard. This is the second oldest consecrated ground in Ireland. A patron takes place annually on the 23rd of June, bonfire night, which is this week. The sacred well and surrounding ring fort are pre-Christian. Bonfire night is an unbroken local tradition since time immemorial. How many seas meandered here since redcoat-hunted priest, the Afrin toned? How many myriad corrosed dawns since whispered consecrations heard? How many leaves from verdant gold have floated neath the arched bridge, when snuffled pilgrims wound their way with fiery pikes to hold on fate, dispersed by weather, cruel or thundering coats, when pealless bells in silence rang. In 1847, the Bishop of Meath, Thomas Nulty, described his personal recollection of the evictions in a pastoral letter to his clergy. 700 human beings were driven from their homes in one day and set adrift on the world. To gratify the caprice of one who, before God and man, probably deserved less consideration than the last and least of them. The horrid scenes I then witnessed, I must remember all my life long. The wailing of women, the screams, the terror, the consternation of children, the speechless agony of honest industrial men, wrung tears of grief from all who saw them. I saw officers and men of a large police force who were obliged to attend on the occasion, cry like children at beholding the cruel sufferings of the very people whom they would be obliged to butcher had they offered the least resistance. The landed proprietors, in a circle all around and for many miles in every direction, warned their tenantry with threats of their direct vengeance against humanity of extending to any of them the hospitality of a single night's shelter. And in more than 3 years, nearly a fourth of them lay quietly in their graves. I'm here at the Mass Rock, the rock above the statue there of Blessed Virgin Mary, and it was here in troubled times when our neighbours across the Irish Sea were chasing down the religious and people who try to attend Mass. The result is the priests and the congregation used to meet in forests and quarries and so forth, found a rock and used it as an altar and said Mass here and said Mass there. It's called the Mass Rock. In Irish it's called Carrig an Afran. Sometimes I become overwhelmed by a sense of sadness, and also by a sense of vengeance for what was done to our people. But there's no point in nurturing feelings of vengeance anymore. We now live and let live. But that doesn't mean that we can't forget. And I will never forget. At least 1 million people are thought to have emigrated as a result of the famine. There were about 1 million long-distance immigrants between 1846 and 1851, mainly to America. The total given in the 1851 census is 967,908. Short-distance immigrants, mainly to Britain, may have numbered more than 200,000. While the famine was responsible for a significant increase in immigration from Ireland of anywhere from 45% to nearly 85%, depending on the year and the county, it was not the sole cause. The beginning of mass immigration from Ireland can be traced to the mid-18th century, when some 250,000 people left Ireland over a period of 50 years to settle in a new world. Irish economist Cormac O'Grada estimates that between 1 million and 1.5 million people emigrated during the years between 1815, when Napoleon was defeated in Waterloo, and 1845, when the Great Famine began. However, the worst of the famine, emigration reached somewhere around 250,000 in 1 year alone, with Western Ireland seeing most of the immigrants. The plaque on the wall there says, "In penal times, Mass was offered here, 1691 to 1829. And I'm sure all of you out there, especially those with Irish ancestry, or many of you overseas living in far-flung lands, would have read and taken an interest on the history of the penal times in Ireland. Horrific chapters in Irish history. Brutality and pain, suffering and criminality imposed on an innocent race of people. How could I forget? Really and truly, how could I forget? How could anybody forget? Yet we forgive and forgave. I just wonder about my sense of feeling in that respect. I really do. Now I'm going to depart this beautiful and peaceful place. I feel a sense of belonging to places like these. I really and truly do. Now, on departing the Mass Rock, I consider that to be a place of solitude and pilgrimage. There's a presence of the ultimate peace and tranquility around there. And walking on the Famine Walk itself, you feel you're doing something good. You're doing something that you feel you belong. And the sign says here, the Famine Road, 1847. So I'm now going to trek that way once again. The famine marked the beginning of depopulation of Ireland in the 19th century. The population had increased by 13 to 14% in the first 3 decades of the 19th century. Between 1831 and 1841, the population grew by 5%. It is not known exactly how many people died during the period of the Great Famine, although it is believed that more died from disease than from starvation. State registration of births, marriages or deaths had not yet begun, and records kept by the Catholic Church are incomplete. One possible estimate has been reached by comparing the expected population with the eventual numbers in the 1850s. A census taken in 1841 recorded a population of 8,175,124. A census immediately after the famine in 1851 had a population of 6 million. Like most of the places that I have taken you in my videos, and I usually recommend that if you have the time and the patience and can spare a day or so, or wherever it takes to visit, go and visit these places. This one, Doonpeter, you need to go and walk the Famine Walk. Grab yourself a Sunday afternoon and don the boots and bring yourself on this pilgrim walk. And I'm sure it'll leave an indelible mark on you when you return home. It'll be always in your head. Like it's a special place. It's a place of pain for many people. I find myself overwhelmed by the carnage on the famine people. I find myself overwhelmed. There's a true sense of shame, probably even guilt. Why I can feel guilt, I don't know. But I hope for generations to come that the history of the Great Famine in Ireland in 1847 will never be written out of the history books. In the decades after the Great Famine, the age of marriage had risen to 28 to 29 for women and 33 for men, and as many as a third of Irish men and a quarter of Irish women never married due to low wages and chronic economic problems that discouraged early and universal marriage. One consequence of the increase in the number of orphan children was that some young women turned to prostitution to provide for themselves. Some of the women who became wrens of the Curragh were famine orphans. The potato blight would return to Ireland in 1879, though by then the rural cottier, tenant farmers and labourers of Ireland had begun the land war, described as one of the largest agrarian movements to take place in 19th century Europe. By the time the potato blight returned in 1879, the Land League, which was led by Michael Davitt, who was born during the Great Famine and whose family had been evicted when Davitt was only 4 years old, encouraged the mass boycott of notorious landlords, with some members also physically blocking evictions. Christine Keneally has written that the major tragedy of the Irish famine of 1845 to 1852 marked a watershed in modern Irish history. Its occurrence, however, was neither inevitable nor unavoidable. The underlying factors which combined to cause the famine were aggravated by an inadequate government response. Keneally notes that the government had to do something to help alleviate the suffering, but that it became apparent that the government was using its information not merely to help it formulate its relief policies, but also as an opportunity to facilitate various long-desired changes within Ireland. There is no doubt that Britain could have saved Ireland, and compares the £9.5 million the government spent on famine relief in Ireland to the £63.9 million they would spend a few years later on the utterly futile Crimean War. The vast majority of historians reject the claim that the British government's response to the famine constituted a genocide. Their position is partially based on the fact that, with regard to famine-related deaths, there was a lack of intent to commit genocide. For a mass death atrocity to be defined as a genocide, it must include the intentional destruction of a people. Contemporary commentators blame the mass death on the actions of the British government rather than the blight. The famine ended in 1849 when the British troops stopped removing the food. While enough food to sustain 18 million people had been removed from Ireland, its population was reduced by more than 2.5 million people to 6.5 million people. While the potato famine may not fit perfectly into the legal and political definitions of genocide, it should be given equal consideration in history as an egregious crime against humanity. The National Famine Commemoration Day is observed annually in Ireland, usually on a Sunday in May. It is also memorialised in many locations throughout Ireland, especially in those regions of Ireland which suffered the greatest losses in the famine. And it is also memorialised overseas, particularly in cities with large populations which have descended from Irish immigrants, such as New York City. Well, folks, as I make my way back from my pilgrim walk on the Famine Walk, Famine Trail, the rain has come upon me. I've been stung by nettles, whacked by electric fences on 3 occasions, and I picked one tick off my ankle. So, all that to get footage of Doonpeter Famine Walk. So I hope you enjoyed it. Now the rain is getting pretty heavy. The glasses are on top of the cap. Well, they're still there. Wouldn't be the first time that I dropped glasses and didn't know about it until I got home. Never again to see. So folks, have a good day. Thank you for tagging along on this pilgrim walk this morning. Short but sweet, sad but profound. So have a good day and have a good weekend. And mind each other and take care. Thanks a million. Bye bye for now. Bye bye. Oh yes, on life's allotted path we walk, complaining of a virus and our little troubles. We are hard done by, we cry. We have forgotten those shriveled bodies, when it was just food, nothing else, that families craved. Now it's our turn to walk the earth, and lucky we are in our time of living. And now when we recall you and see your gaunt frames, we no longer complain and value all the more what we possess.